Hello and welcome to this special edition of the Business of Story. I'm your host, Park Howell. And why is this one any more special than any other show I've done of the past 300 plus shows? Well, because I get to launch my second book with you today and my good friend, Dr. Randy Olson, who co-wrote this book, The Narrative Gym for Business. And I couldn't be more tickled to bring it to you. Randy and I met about, 2013 when he published his second book called Connection. And for those of you that have been avid listeners here of the Business of Story, you've met Randy several times because he's been on here like 4 or 5 times. I can't shake the guy. But I have learned so much from him, where he has been teaching story structure in the and, but, and therefore in the science world, in the academic world. We've become fast friends around it, and I have brought it to the business world to great effect. And why I say that is because if you followed me, you know I started with the hero's journey and the complexity of storytelling. I mapped that to business, my 10-step story cycle system, and it has worked marvels in crafting brand story strategy. But it's hard, it's difficult, it's complex. And in my search for simplicity, I then found the 5 primal elements of a short story for big impact, that you can share a story to make your business point in under 1 minute. And it's hugely powerful, which also led me then to this down the simplified trail to the and, but, and therefore, which to me, after 35 years in the branding world, it is the most foundational narrative framework, the easiest to get, yet one of the hardest to really perfect unless you practice. But it's now what I begin all of my storytelling, training, coaching, teaching with, is teaching the fundamental structure of the and, but, and therefore, and I have no one else to thank but my good friend, Dr. Randy Olson, who is here with us today. Randy, welcome to the Business of Story, and thank you for the opportunity of co-authoring this book with you.
It has been a fun journey with you, Park, and I think we're still only just getting started on this journey.
Well, we just have the book out. I mean, it is fresh off the presses, and you're already a little bit disgruntled about it. Why is that?
Well, I'm a little upset because of the quote that you got us from your buddy Christopher Lochhead that's on the back of the book that claims that our book is unfair.
Well, per usual, Randy, you didn't read the entire quote. He says the book provides an unfair advantage for business communication. And that's what came from Christopher Lochhead. I taught him about the ABT on his podcast about a month and a half ago, and it blew him away. I'm going to share with you a tweet that he wrote using his very first ABT that got over 60,000 engagements within the first day. And he wrote back to me and said, "What in the hell is this? I can't believe how powerful it is." But I'm going to share that tweet with you a little bit later in the show. So, Randy, what makes this ABT such a powerful little messaging marvel?
Well, you've got, I think we added in the text on the back of the book, something effective, this being the ABT being your secret weapon. And that runs the risk of being hype. So we got to back that up. How can we say this is a secret weapon? And the answer to that is that this comes from a different perspective. For 1 century, the people of Hollywood have been trying to understand the brains of the public. And I went to film school in the mid-90s at the University of Southern California Film School. The very first course we had to take there was the history of silent cinema. And they had us read articles that were written back in the 1920s that were about studies trying to figure out how audiences reacted to movies. They were studying this stuff in the 1920s, trying to figure this out. And they have figured out, they had to, because they had a huge incentive, which is to make money, but they haven't shared it with the general public. They've kept it inside of Hollywood. And I think that's a lot of the mission that I set off in the mid-90s was I left the science world wondering, especially in the wake of the movie Jurassic Park, which, it changed the science world. Suddenly, everybody was interested in paleontology and dinosaurs. Why? Because of one movie that Hollywood had produced. That's how much they knew how to reprogram the brains of the masses. So that fascinated me. I went to film school and I set out looking for the Holy Grail. What is the one element at the core of all of this stuff that Hollywood does that explains how it is they understand the public's brain so well? And Park, what is our second quote on the back of the book?
Yeah, we got to thank David Poland from London. He's a founder and director of the Story Spotters, and he just sent this in yesterday. And we had to absolutely put it on the book because he read the book, and it's only 75 pages, so you can get through it in about an hour, hour and a half and start applying it. He writes, "Buy the damn thing. It's the Holy Grail of story."
And there you go, Holy Grail. So again, this runs the risk of hype. A secret weapon, Holy Grail. Is it really? And yes, it is. I think maybe one of the kind of sad things is that I've spent a decade trying to get the science world to grasp this. And scientists are not very good with communication. They haven't listened that well, but it's gaining steam there. And as you know, Park, you're part of my ABT framework course. You do the business segment within there. And the ABT framework course is taken off now, and we're booked all the way into next year, working with big organizations like the National Park Service and FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, who else? Lots of organizations, U.S. Forest Service and Fish and Wildlife, on and on. So they're getting it, and it's very powerful for communication. But the community that picks this stuff up much more quickly is the business world. And you and I did one little run of the course last year for business folks, and just based on that, we saw it taking off. And in fact, your buddy David there from the UK, what happened with me was about 2 months ago, I think I was on the podcast of your friend, Francisco Mafus. Is that his name, in Spain? And
I think you got that right.
Okay. And we did an episode there. And then David, sorry, what's his last name? Poland?
Poland. Yep.
Yeah. From the UK got in touch with me, and he said, a bunch of us over here have been using this ABT thing. We didn't know where it came from. And then we heard you on that podcast, like, oh, that's the guy with the ABT. So he and I had a great conversation and kind of pushed all that further. And this is what I'm finding. And in fact, I mean, when I talk to somebody like David and Francisco, it is such a joy for me, because with the science people, they're constantly pushing back. Well, I don't know if we really need this, and I don't know if we should be trying to, worry about what the public thinks. But the business folks, it all starts there. If we don't listen to the public, we're not going to get anywhere. So it's such a joy to work with the business folks. And I've got a feeling, this book that we've got here, The Narrative Gym, I wrote it last fall in broad form in November, and now you and I have decided to put it inside the context of the business world. And you did a great job writing the 7th chapter. You gave 5 applications of how the ABT framework applies to the business world. And I think this is a much better book than what I had last November. It's like this is a revised draft. We tweaked a bunch of things in it, and I'm really excited about it because it's a bit more focused into your business world and just a little bit better written. And I think lots of people are going to grab it. The little catchphrase that we wanted to put on the cover of the book, but we realized isn't quite so broadly resonant anymore, was to call this the strunk and white of storytelling. But it turns out lots of people, especially younger folks today, have no earthly idea what
the strunk and white, the elements of style. Anyone in journalism of our age, or even a little bit younger, I mean, it was required reading in college. And this is a short, sweet, 75-page book. It is like the strunk and white, or the elements of business storytelling. And what inspired me to reach out to Randy and say, hey, dude, let's do one specifically for business, was the launch of my little short, quick online course, The ABTs of Selling. And all I learned from working with Randy and working with the scientists and all of those different virtual sessions we did throughout COVID and we've been doing this year, I just brought to bear in this 18-minute course. And I reached out to Randy and said, you know what, let's do a companion piece, if you would. Jumped all over it. And this thing came together pretty quickly in about the last month or so. And just rewriting your first book so it is specific to sales, marketing, and business folk. And we're already getting some really great reviews. Our good friend Greg Head, Scaling Point, Greg's List, he's been through our course. He is a believer. Here's what he said on LinkedIn yesterday.
This is Greg, the master of memes.
Yes, the Greg, the master of memes. I should maybe put some of those in our show notes, but only the R-rated ones.
He was one of the very best participants ever in the course, because after every session, within about 15 minutes, he'd send us 3 or 4 memes that he threw together with things that he heard in our lectures. So he's awesome.
Well, he wrote on LinkedIn, he said, the ABT is gold. It is the most powerful framework for communication that I have ever used. Thanks for your podcast, blog posts, and workshops that led up to this book about the ABT. And, Greg has been in the marketing world for almost 4 decades, as long as I have, as a brilliant marketer, and he has seen everything. So to have that come from him is really powerful. But let's talk a little bit about what we often hear, that the ABT, the and button, therefore, is so simple. Can it possibly work? Why does it work, Randy?
Well, here's the first silly thing that comes to mind is you remember that classic iconic scene from Spinal Tap with the guy with the amplifier that goes to 11.
Oh, yeah.
And Rob Reiner keeps asking him, most people's amplifiers just go to 10. How's this one different? And he says, because ours goes to 11. And I think the same way about the ABT, which is because we have a model. Nobody else has a model. We have a model, the ABT framework. And I'd be thrilled to hear somebody else's comparable model, but there just ain't one out there. And this is the only model. And it's this simple model. But then as you read the book, you see that it provides what we mean by framework is that you can hang on it a bunch of other elements. You can add things on and get into all kinds of complexity. But you want to start with simplicity, and that's what the ABT gives you, is all the way down to the core elements of the 3 forces behind these words and, but, and therefore. And the 3 forces that everybody needs to learn and develop an intuitive feel for are agreement, contradiction, and consequence. And realize that effective communication begins with agreement. Doesn't begin with your problem, doesn't begin with yelling at people and things like that. Begins by figuring out, what have we got here that we can agree upon? Now let's do the turn here and start the narrative process.
But in business and sales, they're often coached to lead with that problem. And we have found that is bad advice. And what I've seen is the reason why that is bad advice is what you view as their problem, they may not view it as a problem. So as soon as you roll out that problem statement, you've got them folding their arms and saying, oh yeah, smarty guy, prove it. That's where you've got to start with, we have learned that statement of agreement to validate your audience's perspective, where they are, and to get them nodding, saying, this is your job, you want this, and it's important to you because of this, right? And you get them nodding in agreement. And that's why it's so critical to start with that validation.
All right, I'm going to tell something very stupid you might want to cut out of this, but I'm thinking of an old Three Stooges episode where they go out to this person's house with their vacuum cleaner they're trying to sell, and they bring in a bucket of dirt and they dump it on the carpet, and then they pull out the vacuum cleaner to demonstrate it. And they say, okay, where do we plug it in? And the little old lady says, I don't have any power. And so basically, they were there trying to solve a problem for her, which really wasn't a problem. Her broom swept just fine for the place. And this happens all the time, is people coming up with their wonderful solution, their wonderful product, and yet they fail to begin with that starting point of, do you have a problem, or what's your life like? And understanding the thing. And the other example we talk a lot about, the environmental world does this endlessly. They come forward with all these brainiacs with all their solutions to the environment. When the public doesn't feel there's a problem, the case study we use a lot is from North Dakota, where the environmental movement spent $4 million on a ballot initiative to try and get money from the government to address these conservation problems. And when it was over with, they lost 80-20, and we went out and surveyed the public, and the public said, we don't have any problems. Why are you trying to take our money to solve these environmental things when we don't feel that these things are a problem? We got a lot of wildlife here. Everything seems pretty happy. It all needs to begin with that agreement and figuring out. And this, of course, is what you brought to the course, Park, was your element of you're not the hero. It's your customer's the hero. You've got to listen to the customer. It's so fundamental and yet so frequently bypassed.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And the thing about the ABT is it makes you think about your customer and place them in the center of the story, because if you follow the instruction through the new book, The Narrative Gem for Business, we will show you that you have to first really listen, explore, do your discovery, and write your ABT from the perspective of your customer, not from the brand. Let me give you a quick example, Randy. working with Sharp Electronics, and I talk about this in the ABTs of Selling course. And so here's an example of what I'm talking about. And you can, anybody listening to this, just go to your landing pages and see if you are writing about yourself or if you are writing about the customer and using an ABT to identify the problem from their perspective. So, in working with Sharp Electronics folks, I pulled up one of their landing pages, and let me read this to you. Try not to nod off, Randy, as I go. All right. Document systems. For years, Sharp document products and solutions have been earning high praise and prestigious awards from leading MFP testing organizations. For Sharp, this represents more than just an accumulation of accolades. It means that trusted industry experts as well as customers recognize that the remarkable innovation, user-friendly design, outstanding reliability, unsurpassed security, and boundless expandability of Sharp digital MFPs and copier printers truly exemplify the company's unwavering commitment to quality and excellence. Take a deep breath. So it's all chest pounding. And, nothing against Sharp. They've got all the right information in here. It's just in the wrong order. And this is the way people have been taught in the past to write. But watch what happens when we create an ABT out of it. So I did this for the group and show the little bit of the magic trick. And we rewrote it to say this: shorter runs, quicker turnaround times, complete control over your in-house printing. It's what you want. But your productivity is currently stuck on pause. Therefore, Sharp digital MFPs and copier printers will have you printing like a pro with our industry-leading innovation, user-friendly design, outstanding reliability, unsurpassed security, and boundless expandability. So there you have it. We basically cut all that copy in half. We wrote it with an ABT from the customer's perspective, but we've got the big problem there. Their productivity is currently stuck on pause, and therefore, here's how we are here to help. Now, what I love about this is about 4 days later, I get an email from the sponsor that brought me in to do the training at Sharp, and she was sharing one of their national account managers' notes saying, wow, I have been trying to close this deal for like 4 months. I've been getting nowhere. I just swiped Park's ABT that he shared in the class, put it at the beginning of my presentation. I walked out of there 2 hours later with the contract we were looking for. It basically said, I don't know what's in this thing, but it seems to be kind of magical. So anecdotal, but I hear this often with lots of sales folks. They've been spending 4, 5, 6 months, sometimes being ghosted the whole time, not getting anywhere. And then when they change their presentation using the ABT from the customer's standpoint, everything changes for them.
Well, let me add just one of the greatest attributes of the ABT is that the key word is analytical. It gives you an analytical means of working on communication and messaging, because too often all the creatives get together and they're just saying, it just doesn't have that thing, it just doesn't grab you. And you can spin your wheels and waste so much time with all that vagary. What the ABT gives you is these elemental units that you can focus the discussion on. You know what? The problem is that our therefore just isn't that good. Let's talk about the therefore. Here's the problem that we got. We're not stating the but clearly. It breaks it down into single units that you can have a discussion around and then reassemble them and understand this is how narrative works, these 3 basic forces.
So let me now share with you Christopher Lochhead's tweet. And then we're going to jump into this word but, because we're all told to never use it in sales and marketing and leadership. But again, that is bad advice. So he writes, most entrepreneurs would love to design a new category and build a billion-dollar business. But there is so much startup bullshit on Twitter, it's hard to know who to listen to. Therefore, meet David Sachs. He knows a few things. So he was promoting David Sachs' appearance on Christopher's excellent podcast. And literally within like 24 hours, he had 60,000, almost 61,000 engagements on that particular tweet. He told me in all of his years, he has never, ever seen anything like it. And it just proves out this power formation of the and, but, therefore.
It's the magic bullet.
But why? You're the evolutionary biologist between the two of us here. I play one on TV. Um, why is that word but so powerful to our brain? And does it have any place in evolution that has made us the most aggressive, invasive species ever? Because us Homo sapiens think, plan, and act in story.
Yeah, it's as simple as the key word beneath that is contradiction. That's what it is. And the more you look at our world, you see that everything is driven by contradiction. People like to say the media is all conflict driven. Well, conflict is a subset of contradiction because the media can be driven by mystery, intrigue, all those sorts of things. All of them are contradiction. And this is the fundamental way that we work is that we lay out this kind of plain, even, non upsetting, peaceful world, and then we contradict something, and that activates the brain. That starts the whole process. That's called narrative. And we mentioned in the first chapter, I mentioned about Jeff Bezos about 3 years ago made this statement, I'm banning PowerPoint, enough of this death by PowerPoint. There's no death by PowerPoint. What he wanted to ban was non-narrative. That's what the problem is. When people fall into the world that's non-narrative, where they're just wandering through information, they've lost the narrative. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what's the central problem that we're working on here. And this is what we deal with in the course a lot, is you realize how many of these people have got multi-million-dollar grants, and you ask them, tell me in 5 words or less, what is the main problem you're studying? And they can't tell you. And they just, well, there's like, we're working on this and we're to that, and there's this and that. You really ought to know what is your core problem in 5 words or less. That's the fundamental challenge that we use all the time. And that's what gives you focus, because it all comes down to the problem that we're working on. And if you aren't clear on that, then everything else downstream of that is just going to be a big jumbled up mess. So that is the answer to what you say. The word but empowers or embodies this power of contradiction. That's what it's all about. That's when you sit up, is when you hear the contradiction. You can hear people going on and on with and. And by the way, all you have to do is look at the front page of the New York Times on any given day. You will see these articles written. The first 2 or 3 paragraphs are laying out that and. Here's an issue. Here's what's been going on. But this morning, and you'll see paragraphs that start with the word but, and there's your ABT structure loud and clear on this very broad communication venue where they have to use the structure to reach the audience.
Well, listen to NPR too. They are often throwing to upcoming segments, and they've got that big but right in the middle of it because it triggers that contradiction, and our brain is looking for change, wondering, okay, so you're taking me down one path, but now has led me somewhere else, and it ignites the limbic subconscious system somewhere in there saying, oh, now you've got my attention, this arouse and fulfill idea. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I learned that from a communications professor at USC 20 years ago when I interviewed a whole bunch of faculty there about science communication. And what he had said to me is there's a century of literature in the academic world and theoretical literature about that simple couplet, arouse and fulfill. And the way he explained it to me is broad communication at its core is as simple as 2 things. First, you want to arouse the interest of your audience. Then you want to fulfill their expectations once you've lit that fire. But it all has to begin with that arousal part. And the way you create arousal is you lay out this world that they can understand, then you turn it. And it's in that moment of turning, that's when you've aroused them. And once you've aroused them, then they instantly want to know what's the therefore. Okay, therefore, where are we going to with all this? The principles are all fairly simple at the core.
I mean, is it fair to say that our brain is very much of a cause and effect machine? So as soon as we made that change, it's like, oh God, okay, well, what's the effect of this and what do I have to do next?
Well, the thing I'll add on to the arouse and fulfill couplet that I realized early on is that when you take a look at Hollywood versus academia, those are the 2 worlds that I've gotten to know in my 2 careers. I was a professor in the academic world. Then I became a filmmaker and spent the last 25 years in and around Hollywood. And you see that both of those communities fall short on the arouse and fulfill. In the case of academics, they bypass the arouse. They're not real good at arousal. You go to a conference of a bunch of academics, and they're so deep into the fulfillment, the information, the substance, that they just don't bother with the arousal. We all can agree that we're here to just learn all this stuff. Well, the public's not that interested in it. So academics fall short on the first element of arousal. They're great with the fulfillment. Hollywood's the opposite. They are so good at the arousal. They just don't know what in the world the fulfillment is about. And one of my favorite scenes I've ever done in one of my films was in my movie Sizzle about global warming. It was a mockumentary, and we had this scene where these two flaky Hollywood producers were talking to me about global warming. And they said, and we're really, really upset about global warming, and we're just, we're consumed by it. But we just don't understand why we're so upset. And that's the problem in Hollywood. They get wound up on issues, but they can't explain to you what the issue is or why we should be, we just know we need to be upset about this. So you need both things. You need arouse and fulfill.
And if you are starting with the problem, you are not setting the stage at all for creating any sort of arousal. You are just jumping right in, and they're like, oh my God, am I supposed to care about this? Do I care about this? Is this really the problem? That's why that statement of agreement in the end is so critical to set the ordinary world. And here's what's at stake for you. Now let's arouse them. But you don't have it because of this. You're right. Therefore, let me show you how we can solve your problem.
Let me add one little tidbit for any hardcore listeners that really want to dive deeper into the communication side of it. There is a book called They Say, I Say, written by Gerald Graff and Kathy Birkenstein. You had them as guests early on in the show. And that book has sold over 2 million copies in the humanities world on college campuses. And what that book is about is the use of templates and argumentation. And you look at the title, They Say, I Say, and you realize that's the same structure. That's and, but. They've just left off the therefore at the end. But that's what they say is the standard way to set up a good argument, which is you begin with they say. You begin with what we can all agree on. Everybody for years and years has said this, but I say the following. And Jerry Graff is so good on this stuff. We've been buddies for 15 years. About 2 years ago, he sent me an email out of the blue on a Sunday and said, I was reading an editorial in the New York Times this morning and thinking to myself, is it not the case that this word but is the single most important word in the entire English language? And I had already at the same time been converging on the same feeling, which is, yeah, there's all kinds of powerful words, like sex and violence and whatever. But those aren't used that much day in and day out. The word but is used by everybody all day long, and it turns the conversation. It has a power to it. And it is the most powerful word in the entire English language. And somebody in the not too distant future, I guarantee you, will write an entire book about the word but. People are going to begin to put the pieces together because it's at the core of how we communicate.
When I was teaching at Arizona State University, sustainable storytelling in the school there, I was working with also a leadership coach and two others. And Kevin Gazzara, the leadership coach, after I got up and talked about the and, but, and therefore, and the power of but, he came in and basically said, okay, I know Park said but in leadership, you don't ever want to use the word but because it negates everything that came before it. Randy, we love having you on the team and you make all kinds of great contributions, but so there's that contradiction. So you've just screwed with Randy's head. Great. Fair point. You probably don't want to use it in that case, but if you are selling anything, it is the single most powerful word to get your audience to see the change, the contradiction that's happening, and really raise the stakes for them of why they have to do something. Otherwise, they're not going to get what they want to get. That leads to the therefore statement. It just seems so simple.
It's so simple. And let me add a bit to that draws on another one of the guests that I brought you, my buddy, Mike Backus.
Oh, yeah.
Who, was a Hollywood screenwriter and today is one of the world's top experts on the subject of medical marijuana. His book is enormously popular. And just recently, he said to me, he's absorbed the ABT framework in a big way. He uses it in all of his communications. And he said to me recently, I've gotten to the point now where when I do Q&A sessions or a press conference and I've got people asking me questions and I lose my way, I know all I have to do is say one word, but, and everybody, even if they're checking their cell phones or whatever, will suddenly look up like, what's he about to say? But what, and if you said the word but and walked off the stage, they'd follow you out in the parking lot. But what were you going to say? That's what it does. It lights the fire in the brain. Let me tell you the thing I did on my podcast last week, 2 weeks ago in the New York Times was the obituary for Dickie Magley, who was a legendary college football player who set all kinds of records as a running back, did all kinds of amazing stuff and died at age 86. And the thing he ended up being known best for was not all of the and of what he did with all of these records that he set. It was the but, which is that in one bowl game, he was running a touchdown, and some guy on the other team jumped off the bench and ran out in the field and tackled him from out of bounds. And there's a quote from him shortly before he died, just bitching about, I go and set all these records. I live a whole life, and the only thing anybody remembers me for is that one play where that schmuck ran out and tackled me. There you go. That's what we lock onto, is the contradiction.
Well, you could say the same thing about, was it Buckner, the first baseman that let that ball dribble through his legs and lost the World Series? Here he has like this all-star Hall of Fame career, but they remember that moment.
Yes, exactly. And I was just tangling on that subject this morning on Twitter, where some study came out about some media outlet did a survey and found that the major evening news on television spent more time covering Jeff Bezos' space trip last week, more minutes than they did all last year covering climate change.
Really?
And somebody tweeted about that, all outraged. Why is Jeff Bezos' one little flight out there more interesting than all this climate stuff? Well, there's the singular contradiction of what people normally do versus climate is kind of everywhere. There's the one guy that on his own went up and out into space. It's that fundamental divide, that contradiction.
So let's talk about the deceptive ease of crafting an ABT. And what I mean by that is, with the ABTs of Selling online course, I was working with an extraordinarily large North American retailer in their internal sales teams. And I had them take my little 18-minute course before our very first session. And then I had them send me the ABTs, as I've seen and learned from you. Building these ABTs live with a group is really, really powerful. So we start the first session. We're not 10 minutes into that first session, and the sponsor, the guy that brought me in, interrupts, and he said, "Okay, Park, I think we've got this ABT thing down. You're going to teach us the next thing, right?" And I'm like, "No, because I don't think you have this ABT thing down. Let's build 4 of them and see what happens." Well, we spent the next 90 minutes building, coaching, and working on those 4. When we were done with the session, I get an immediate call from the sponsor to do a debrief on it. And he's like, "Wow, you're right. These things were all over the place. They were long-winded. They weren't in the right order. I see it takes practice." Comment on that, because you build these all the time. I mean, thousands of these, it seems like now, with the scientists you've been working with.
And that leads us to the title of the book, The Narrative Gym, which is the entire concept. It's the idea that the narrative part of your brain is like a muscle that needs to be conditioned over time. You cannot learn this stuff in a one afternoon workshop. You've got to get a good solid training and then work on that. We're about to resume our ABT framework course in a couple weeks with rounds 15 and 16. And this time I've come up with a simple little metaphor with one of the instructors, which is, we're going to begin by telling everybody, when you finish this course, these 10 1-hour sessions, you're not going to be a tree when you finish. You're going to be a sapling. And once you're done, it's up to you then to continue this work at the narrative gym, which is a sort of figurative idea, and continue to work on narrative. And eventually you can grow into being a narrative tree. And even the best people in Hollywood, no one ever masters narrative. It's endlessly elusive. It's just a body of intuition that you hope to develop. Some people get really, really good at it, but nobody's perfect, because the audience is constantly changing. You're trying to chase after the audience. But that's the idea, is that there are a whole bunch of different things that we're doing now, which is not only the course, but we have something that goes with it called Working Circles. And then we have the ABT Time podcast, in which every episode of the podcast has got exercises in there, basically, or us applying the ABT in the real world. And it's about constantly working this stuff and thinking through this narrative structure of everything around us, because the bottom line is that narrative is everything. Narrative structure underpins everything from argumentation to logic to reason to story to the scientific method to comedy, on and on. It's our whole world.
Well, as I mentioned up top, I started with the complexity of storytelling coming out of Hollywood, with the hero's journey mapped to business through my story cycle system, and ultimately landed on the ABT thanks to you. And what I tell people is, the ABT is literally your storytelling dumbbell. again, the narrative gym for business, is curl it every day. And one of the best places to practice your ABTs are in your emails. You already got to write the darn thing. So it's the concept of habit stacking, something you already have to do. Start practicing these ABTs. And what I learned from my executives going through the master's course at ASU is when they use the ABTs in their email writing, they were much shorter. They were much quicker for their audience to read, and people would actually say thank you. And they have a call to action built in your therefore, and it starts working on that narrative framework, that narrative intuition that you're looking for. But also use them in Twitter, use them in Instagram, use them everywhere you're already doing content.
Park, what is the cover artwork for this book?
It's a storytelling dumbbell, isn't it?
There you go.
Curl the darn thing. So, Randy, let's get to the therefore. Buy the book. It's only $6.99. And like we said, it's like the strunk and white for the elements of business storytelling. You can get through it about 90 minutes to 2 hours. You can apply what we're teaching you in it. We have all kinds of examples there. And then you have to practice, practice, practice. And the thing is, just like they said in the back of the book, it will give you an unfair advantage in all of your messaging. It is a messaging marvel. I call the DNA of story, because it is where all story begins, is really understanding the setup, problem, resolution dynamic. And an ABT you can share in under 20 seconds to hook your audience from the very, very start.
Park, do you feel passionate about this ABT thing?
I love it, man. I love it. I mean, when I first learned about it, 2013, I was like everybody else. Nah, this thing is so simple, it can't possibly work. And yet something else in me said, no, dude, I think there's something here. You got to kind of prove it to yourself. And so we've checked it out over time through nursery rhymes and the Gettysburg Address and pop culture. And it literally is everywhere. And for the listeners now that you are a little bit more familiar with it, you are going to start seeing it and hearing it everywhere. Just listen for that but word and you'll know what they're doing to you out there.
Therefore,
Randy, thanks so much for being here. Thanks for putting the book together. You can get it on Amazon, Kindle version, print version. It is the ideal companion piece to the ABTs of Selling online quick course. And I am just delighted to bring this to the world with you.
same for me. And it is so much fun working with you. You get this stuff and it's a joy. I hate to say it, I spent a lot of time in the science world beating my head against a brick wall. But when I come to the business world, everybody gets this stuff. They take it out of our hands and put it to use. And that's what you want to do.
Well, thank you all for listening to this edition of The Business of Story. If you liked what you heard, absolutely share it with your world. Get your book over at Amazon.com. Check out the ABTs of Selling at businessofstory.thinkific.com. And if I could be of service to you with virtual training and coaching sessions, or now, of course, in-person training and coaching sessions, or if you'd like to double up and have both Randy and I with your group, please reach out to me at park@businessofstory.com. We'll get back to you, and we would love to take your team through how to use the ABT to absolutely captivate your audiences and convert them into lifelong customers. So thanks for listening. If you need anything else from me, just come on over to thebusinessofstory.com. And until I see you there, remember that the most potent story you'll ever tell is a story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. Thanks for listening.
Awesome.